Today is Friday of the 22nd week in Ordinary Time. So, who really is Jesus? In our first reading, St. Paul uses words and images, our only tools, to try to capture a sense of Jesus in his divinity. The result is both admirable, considering the limitations of words and images, and woefully inadequate because of the limitation of words and images. Let's look at two verses from our first reading, verses 19 and 20 from the letter to the Colossians, chapter 1. I will use the New Revised Standard Version translation. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. Jesus' death on the cross took on board all the violence being done to him, and all the violence cosmically, forever, and the violence was dissolved in the divine love. So in the resurrection stories, we see his disciples' relief and joy at his presence and their reunion with him and with God. I think that this relief and joy in the midst of violence and anguish is what St. Paul calls making peace through the blood of his cross. It's frankly a strange sort of peace, bought at a high price. Worse, it should be cosmically complete because Jesus is God. But, St. Paul says, Jesus' blood brought only incomplete relief and joy. In verse 24, St. Paul says, I am now rejoicing in my suffering for your sake, you Colossians, and in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of the church. The rest of the peace and joy Jesus has to offer the world comes from our suffering, our blood. This is quite astounding. Jesus' afflictions were incomplete, and you and I can make up the difference on behalf of the world. Have you ever suffered because you were helping a loved one who was struggling, a child who was fearful of bullying, an elder who was saddened by physical limitations? Or perhaps you had to make hard decisions in the workplace, to cut back work hours, to reprimand someone, even to fire someone. Have you suffered the moral injury inflicted on us by politicians, religious leaders, or supervisors whose words and actions offended our sense of moral values? As we do so in faith, Jesus says, our suffering completes his for the benefit of other people, somehow bringing relief and peace into the situation. Of course, our suffering, like Jesus's, can be intense and can linger long after the events that caused it. So in this sense, we have to ask questions about whether our suffering, or Jesus's for that matter, really made a difference. Sometimes we can see the difference in the loved one, the child or the elderly person. For someone we reprimanded or fired, the moment of our doing so, painful as it was, may have inaugurated a new era in their lives. But sometimes we have to wonder. I make no claim that this brief comment explains one of the greatest of all mysteries, that of Jesus' death and resurrection. It is a mystery that we can come to perceive through long and often hard experience. But having lived this way for the second half of my life, I'm coming to realize that the mystery is very real, and that I am glad I chose this path, though the good I may have wrought is little known to me in many instances. But as we are faithful, the relief and the peace can come to us, not as giddy moments in the sun, but as realizations intuited in the quiet of our hearts. So let's try to be faithful to this mystery one more day and ask the Lord for relief and peace, and in the fullness of time, some wisdom and understanding.